Hey everyone, D&D Detective here, and here are 15 minorly annoying things in 5th edition. By minor, I mean things that wouldn't require vast rule changes or major rebalancing, but rather minor, arbitrary restrictions, small annoying aspects of the game, or just small things that make the game more complicated than necessary. Number 15. Improved Divine Smite has nothing to do with Divine Smite. You might be thinking with its title, well clearly this is just a better version of Divine Smite. In reality, all Improved Divine Smite is giving is an extra 1d8 radiant damage when you hit a creature with a melee weapon, which, don't get me wrong, is a great ability, but it isn't related to your Divine Smite feature. Even Jeremy Crawford has admitted that this one should have been rephrased. I wouldn't be surprised if we see this name updated. Number 14. Rogues can't do sneak attack damage with longswords. Rogues getting proficiency with longswords is a throwback to earlier editions. But the thing is, longswords use strength, so they are already an odd pick for a rogue to use. To top that off though, you also can't do any sneak attack damage with them because they are neither a finesse or ranged weapon. Number 13. Chill Touch is poorly named. Chill Touch has nothing to do with cold, does necrotic damage, and it's not a touch spell. Skeletal Touch might have worked better, though Lich Slap seems to be the going favorite online. Number 12. Half your hit dice being restored on a long rest. Very quickly, my group gave up on using this rule. The rule does make lower level D&D more difficult, but by the time you start getting into Tier 2 or higher, you'll start to gain access to enough healing that it really shouldn't matter much anyways. But who wants to start an adventuring day with having some awkward number of hit dice, instead of it just being them all back? Other than the limited wish from the Genie Warlock, I can't think of any other resource that doesn't come back on a long rest. Ultimately, this seems like a rule for tracking a resource that has a very limited purpose. Number 11. Mending, taking a minute to cast. There is this sort of obscure rule regarding concentration that I imagine a lot of groups overlook, either because they miss the reference to it, since it isn't found in the section on concentration, or because it's just not convenient to run. The rule is that any spell that has a casting time of more than one action takes your concentration during casting. This means that if you cast a spell like Mending, which takes a minute to cast, you need to use your concentration to do so. So if you were playing, say, a Battlesmith Artificer and cast Enhance ability on yourself, thinking you'd be getting an hour out of the spell, but then you cast Mending on your Steel Defender to repair it, under the rules, you'll lose your concentration on Enhance ability because of that Mending spell. Oh, and to add insult to injury, Mending is the only cantrip that has a minute-long casting time. Number 10. You can't smite with your fists. This is one of those things that has come about based on guidance from Jeremy Crawford, and more recently, the Sage Compendium. The reason being, this line mentions a weapon being used, but it's a good example of the game just being unnecessarily nitpicky. Just let the unarmed guy smite their hearts out already. They even recently came out with a whole bunch of errata, as well as Sage Compendium update, and rather than just errata this, and make it so the text works with unarmed strike, they just came out with this long explanation about it, when they could have just adjusted it. Number 9. Druids will not wear metal armor. This is one of those holdovers from earlier editions, but I can't think of anywhere else where a class or subclass feature is phrased this way. It's not that you can't wear metal armor, it's that you won't. Metal weapons, like scimitars and daggers, are apparently all good though. I understand that there are various reasons online about how this goes back to this and that edition from earlier, or some historic reference to druids or whatever, but it's just silly and it's restrictive, and no other class faces this kind of restriction. Number 8. Tridents can't benefit from polearm master. Tridents, despite costing more than spears, can't benefit from the polearm master feat, even though they are martial weapons and spears are basic weapons. So why use a trident, you ask? Honestly, other than getting access to a small handful of magic weapons, or looking really cool, there really isn't a reason. Mechanically, spears are just better. Number 7. Pikes only benefit from the second feature of the polearm master feat, but not the first one. The rationale being that they are difficult to use and very long, although apparently not long enough for you to get any extra reach out of them. Before Tasha's, using a pike was just the worst option. Now, with them having access to the piercer feat, they at least have something they can use that gives them some uniqueness compared to other polearm options. Beyond just costing less and weighing a lot more, I mean. But honestly, I think excluding them from half the benefit of the polearm master feat just makes the feat more complicated than it needed to be. Number 6. Rangers being spells known casters. Artificers and paladins both prepare their spells, but rangers don't, and so they can't switch their spells out on a long rest. Instead, they have to wait until they level up, and even then, only switch one out at a time. Even your spellcasting description describes you as casting spells, much like a druid does, so I would think it makes a lot of sense for you to prepare spells in a similar way to druids, paladins, artificers, and clerics. Number 5. The interaction between blindsight, truesight, see invisibility, and the invisible condition. These let you see the creature, which means you can cast spells on them that you couldn't cast if you couldn't see them. It also means that you can make opportunity attacks against them at disadvantage. Some monsters, like the basilisk, also can use their abilities that rely on sight because of their access to special senses. As written, all of these will cancel out the first bullet point of the invisible condition. However, none of these cancel out the fact that you have disadvantage on attacks against an invisible creature, or that they have advantage on attacks against you. At least when it comes to the invisible condition. If this is a restriction that sounds like it makes things unnecessarily complicated, you'd be right, but Jeremy Crawford himself has confirmed that this is the case. He rationalizes it by saying, with these sights, you would be visible, but distorted in some way that makes it harder for you to hit and defend against. But I think it's the kind of unnecessary thing that just overcomplicates the condition. It becomes particularly silly when you realize that Fairy Fire, a first level spell, cancels out this penalty. But the 6th level spell True Seeing, which lets you see into the ethereal plane and see magical doors, just can't cancel out all the effects of the invisible condition. In reality, all 3 of these should cancel out this second bullet point, at least within range. No need to make this more complicated than it has to be. Number 4. The interaction between blinded condition and blindsight. In a similar manner, not all aspects of the blinded condition become invalid, even within the range of blindsight. The first line here is irrelevant because with blindsight, you don't require sight to perceive your surroundings for these ability checks. As you can see here, Jeremy Crawford has noted that blindsight qualifies for anything in the D&D rules that requires you to see something, provided that thing is within the blindsight's radius. However, just like with the invisible condition, as written, the second bullet point is not made invalid with blindsight, since there isn't any conditional statement saying something like that you have disadvantage on attack rolls on creatures that you can't see. And since blindsight itself does not state it grants immunity to the blinded condition within its radius, which means that any attack rolls you make while you have the blinded condition are made with disadvantage, and attack rolls made against you are made with advantage, even within the radius of your blindsight. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of groups ignore this, and rightly so. It's only really relevant for creatures that have blindsight, but that don't have immunity to the blinded condition. Creatures, for instance, like bats, scorpions, and dragons, as well as characters that have managed to pick up blindsight through an ability or spell. The reality is that both these second bullet points, for invisible and blinded, should just be covered exclusively by the unseen attacker's rules. But as written, these bullet points are actually treated separately, as dumb as that sounds. Number 3. Time outside of combat is poorly defined and clunky, and I'm particularly thinking here for certain abilities and spells that lasts for 10 minutes. 10 minutes is frankly ill-defined. If you read up on the rules under time, it says that the DM might use a different time scale depending on the task, but gives this as an example. In a dungeon environment, the adventurer's movement happens on a scale of minutes. It takes them about a minute to creep down a long hallway, another minute to check for traps at the door at the end of the hallway, and a good 10 minutes to search the chamber beyond for anything interesting or valuable. But how long it takes to search a chamber is going to depend on how many people are in your group and the size of that chamber. So the guidance here feels very vague. Increasingly, we're starting to see more abilities, like say the stars and spores, Druid forms, that last 10 minutes. But how useful any of these 10-minute abilities are can depend a lot on what exactly 10 minutes means in practice. This is particularly true for the Astral Self Monk, who has 3 of its abilities that have 10-minute durations. And it's not just 10-minute abilities and spells either. Take, for instance, the Archfey Warlock's Fey Presence ability. Using this ability out of combat is a bit awkward because it lasts until the end of your next turn, which means it lasts maybe 12 seconds, compared to Charm Person lasting an hour. It just feels like an ability they didn't think about out of combat uses for. I don't know what the answer is here, whether it's just to allow certain 10-minute abilities and spells to last longer, or for the developers to provide more in the way of guidance for how long 10 minutes should be. Clearly, there are some spells, like Wall of Force, that shouldn't last for like an hour, but there are other concentration spells, like Clairvoyance and Locate Object, that could probably last longer without breaking the universe. Same goes with at least some of the new abilities that last 10 minutes currently. The vagueness of time out of combat doesn't matter for enough spells and abilities for it to be a major issue, but with more subclasses having 10-minute abilities, there are just enough of them for this vagueness to become a bit annoying. Number 2, somatic components are only castable with the hand that holds a focus if the spell involves a material component. Basically, if the spell doesn't have a material component, you'll need a free hand. Now, clerics and paladins can get around this by putting their holy symbol on their shield. Artificers can also get around it through the use of an infusion. But other classes have to rely on the Warcaster feat in order to get around this, which I find particularly annoying as a huge fan of the Stars Druid. As written, you need to be holding your Stars map to have Guiding Bolt and Guidance. Since Guiding Bolt does not have a material component, you would need to have a free hand on top of that, which means no shield. The funny part about this is that the Warcaster feat was obviously in the player's handbook, which means that as they are writing it, they are aware of these kind of awkward interactions, yet decided to relegate the solution to an optional rule. They should have just addressed it properly. Number 1. All the rules surrounding vials of acid, alchemist fire, and similar items. The rules surrounding these weapons are a mess, and most of it comes down to the fact that they are considered to be improvised weapons. But I'll start with some common facts about them. Since they are improvised weapons, unless you have the Tavern Brawler feat, you aren't adding your proficiency bonus to your attack roll for them. Throwing these objects can't be done as part of the attack action. Instead, they take their own action, which means you can't throw more than one each turn, at least not without action surge. It also means any feature that requires you to take the attack action also doesn't apply because you aren't using the attack action. They are considered to be ranged attacks, which means you get disadvantage if you use them within melee range. Even in the case of the Vial of Acid, where it says it can be applied in melee range, since even then, you're still making a ranged attack. Since they don't have the thrown property, you use your dexterity modifier for attack rolls and to add extra damage. These items also don't meet the requirements of improvised weapons for doing the improvised weapons standard 1d4 damage. so they just do the damage they say they do, plus any dexterity bonus. While you are making a ranged weapon attack with them, because they don't appear on the list of ranged weapons, you aren't making an attack with a ranged weapon. So even if you acquired proficiency with them, the third bullet point of the sharpshooter feat doesn't work with them. Finally, my reading of Alchemist Fire and the rules is that this does 1d4 plus dexterity fire damage, but not when the weapon first hits, but instead at the start of the hit creature's turn, even if it feels a bit odd to be doing a bonus dexterity damage each turn. So to conclude, it may not seem like it, but even to get to this understanding required me to do a lot of Googling, reading over sage advice, reading over Twitter posts, and rules, and it was way more complicated than it should have been. Let's be honest, nothing about these weapons is improvised. They aren't table legs. They are thrown, single-use weapons that are designed to work on creatures. Alchemist Fire would certainly need to be rebalanced if it were to be used as a simple or martial ranged weapon. But how they work currently is so unnecessarily complicated. Just using them with a catapult spell, DM permitting, is so much easier. Alright, that's it for the video. As usual, if you liked what you saw here, be sure to like and subscribe. What were your thoughts about my list? Did you disagree with something I said? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.